Excellent. Well, thanks for joining us here at Parliament House this afternoon. No one could have expected the situation that literally hundreds of thousands of Australians find themselves in today, having lost their job or lost significant income as a result of coronavirus. We've been working through since March 29, when the Prime Minister announced a package of relief for residential tenancies, the key aspect of which was a moratorium on evictions. Last week, the Palaszczuk government announced a framework for how we would implement that in Queensland. Part of that framework gave a regulation-making power to establish a set of guidelines for how tenants and landlords should come together and resolve the very difficult situation that so many of them face right today, which is that they can't afford to pay the rent. And that is not the fault of landlords, and it's not the fault of tenants. As I said, no one could have expected the situation that they were in. Now, we've been working hard since we released that framework with stakeholders, with representatives of the property sector, with tenants and the real estate sector to establish those guidelines. And I'm pleased to announce that this afternoon the Palaszczuk government has reached a resolution of the matters of concern that have been discussed over the last few days. I'm very pleased to indicate that the guidelines that have been settled today will be published and they will form part of the package of reforms that we bring to Parliament next week when it sits, to ensure that no tenant in Queensland that's unable to pay their rent gets evicted during the coronavirus period. I want to ensure the mum and dad investors out there that this package takes into full account the concerns that they've raised over recent days. We know that for many of those mum and dad investors, that they're not rich, they're not wealthy, they simply invested in a property for their family's future. And our guidelines protect that investment and ensure that there is a process for landlords and tenants being able to come together to reach a resolution in the case where the tenant just simply can't pay the rent in circumstances where they've lost their job or where they've lost income because of coronavirus. Now, the Residential Tenancies Practice Guide goes through a range of areas and issues. It covers matters in relation to how a tenant would prove a loss of income. That's very important. We've seen a threat of rental strikes in New South Wales and Victoria, and our government's been very clear. It is not appropriate, just because the Prime Minister has said there's a moratorium on evictions, for a tenant to simply say, I'm just not going to pay the rent. There has been a significant amount of investment by the taxpayer in support for Australians who've lost their job because of the coronavirus. The JobKeeper package, the JobSeeker package and the supplement will ensure that most Queenslanders will be able to meet their rental obligations. And in circumstances where they can't, we will have a framework in Queensland which will support them to come together and reach an amicable solution. And where they can't, there will be compulsory conciliation where the parties will be able to make arrangements that best suit them. One of the contentious matters that's been discussed this week has been around whether or not there should be a requirement for a tenant to pay back the difference. Queensland will take a position the same as all other states and territories, that will be a matter for tenants and landlords to work out in the best interests of the long-term security of tenure for that tenant and the financial security of the property owner. We'll have a system in place that will support them to do that, and it will include full disclosure of the financial circumstances of a tenant and the property owner through the conciliation process. We do, however, expect that most tenants and landlords will come together and reach an amicable solution, just as they already are across the state. We will ensure that the moratorium on evictions is implemented by requiring leases that expire before the 6-month period to be rolled over until at least September 30 or shorter if the parties agree. We have agreed today with the real estate sector on methods to ensure that virtual inspections can happen if a property owner wants to sell their property. I don't think I've ever had so many Zoom or Facebook Live meetings in my life as I have over the last 2 weeks, and we're all coming to grips with the need to use digital technology to perform our everyday tasks. And that's exactly what's going to happen in residential properties. We'll make sure that property owners and their agents can still access the property for emergency and essential repairs. I want to make this point really clear. That means, particularly for things that are about health and safety, take smoke alarms for example, tenants will still be required to allow that electrician to come in and make sure their smoke alarm is functioning. It would be a terrible outcome if through protections for tenants we saw the loss of life because we didn't have a nuanced approach to access to the property. There were a lot of concerns raised by property owners about a misinformation that was in the marketplace about people just simply being able to break their lease or abandon their property. There are limited circumstances with a very high threshold in which we will allow a tenant to break their lease without notice, with just a week's notice. An example of which might be two students share housing under the age of 22. If they're a part-time student, they're not entitled to youth allowance and they're not entitled to New Start. Under the current welfare arrangements in this nation, those students would be receiving nil income. Clearly not enough to pay the rent, certainly not enough to buy food or transport. In those circumstances, we think it's reasonable, and we're pleased that the property sector has agreed that it's reasonable that if those two young people have somewhere else to go, that they can break their lease and not be required to pay out the rest of their lease terms. I'm also very pleased to announce today that the government will make a $20 million rental grant fund available. That will support around 7,000 households in Queensland who are vulnerable in between the time of the start of the shutdown due to coronavirus and the flow through of those Commonwealth welfare supplements. That will ensure that those 7,000 households are able to reach a resolution with their landlord and equally that those vulnerable Queenslanders don't end up homeless and the property owner doesn't end up in financial distress themselves. This is about making sure that everybody is taken care of. As the Premier said to me when property owners raised their concerns, she said, Mick, we need to ensure that all Queenslanders are taken care of throughout the coronavirus, and I need you to fix this to make sure that our framework does that, and I'm pleased to say that's what the guidelines deliver. Finally, I think it's important that we closely monitor the framework and its implementation. And so today I can also announce that I'll establish a special COVID-19 Housing Security Committee. I've invited onto this committee the Real Estate Institute of Queensland, Tenants Queensland, the Queensland Council of Social Services, Q-Shelter and the Residential Tenancies Authority, who will provide independent monitoring and observation of the relationships between tenants and landlords that find themselves in stress and may need to enter into negotiations. And they'll be providing me regular updates so that government can consider their needs, ensure that nobody falls into homelessness, and ensure that no property owner, no mum and dad investor loses their home because of coronavirus and the arrangements that have been established in partnership with the real estate sector. So I'm very pleased and I'm thankful for all of the feedback that was received over previous days, and I'm very thankful that such a complex policy issue has been worked through by all of the stakeholders in such a rapid amount of time. I expect that the guidelines will be published in coming days, and they'll certainly be made available online and operational before the amendments to the Act are made here at Parliament House on Wednesday. So there was a number of stages to our framework. Of course, the Prime Minister made the announcement on the 29th of March, and unlike in commercial tenancies, left it to each state and territory to implement individually. Despite attempts to achieve alignment across states, because of the complex differences between states, each state has gone it alone. Queensland wanted, though, to provide real security and clarity, and so we took the first step of announcing a framework last Thursday. Other states have identified how they can improve upon that framework, and in the implementation of our guidelines, we've adopted some of those improvements as well. They weren't the guidelines. That was there are a number of pieces. There is amendments to the Act, there is a regulatory piece, and there is the practice guidelines. And there was always going to be a challenge in trying to identify a balanced approach that met every single circumstance. And so as we've got closer and closer to reaching a resolution on that, we've been able to identify the best way to do that. And I'm very pleased that today I think we've got a real balance. It's not going to be easy though. These guidelines aren't going to solve everybody's problem. There is still going to be people doing it tough out there because of coronavirus. Awesome. So we think it's a really important question. There are two mechanisms by which we will establish the way in which a tenant has lost income to be able to be covered by the freeze on evictions. And they are that you've lost more than 25% of your income, or that you've lost so much of your income that you're paying more than 30% of your rent, 30% of your income on rent, and you can't afford the other necessities of life, that you can't afford food or medicine. And so I can't put a dollar figure on that because depending on the individual circumstances of the property and of the individual, that's going to change. And that's why there is a real complexity in the development of a framework here and these guidelines, and why we're going to have to watch closely to ensure that every Queenslander is taken care of on both sides of the market. It's a two-way street, renting. There is a property owner that gives up a valuable asset for the benefit of others, and others pay rent for that, and we need to make sure that they're both secure. So the way that inspections will work is if there are no concerns around health or safety, that the inspections are able to occur in accordance with the Chief Health Officer's mandates around social distancing and isolation, they'll occur as normal. However, if somebody has a concern about their safety, they might be self-isolating or they're in fact in home quarantine, then we will change the Residential Tenancies Act to allow for virtual inspections. We'll be working with the stakeholders across the next couple of days to provide some guidelines around how those virtual inspections can happen. But as I said before, we're all coming to grips with doing things through a computer screen or through the screen of our phone, and the same will happen for residential landlords, agents and their tenants. Tenants and landlords enter into a partnership agreement when they set a rent for their property, and we feel that the best way forward is to ensure that that relationship continues. Tenants pay the rent that they can afford, and property owners charge the rent that they think that they can get in the market. To be able to be covered by the freeze on evictions, though, you will need to demonstrate the 25%. There's nothing stopping tenants and landlords at any time entering into negotiations around their rent, but there is a requirement during the 6-month freeze on evictions that if you want to take advantage of that, you have to be able to demonstrate. There's no rorts here, there's no rip-offs. You have to be able to demonstrate that you've lost income. Okay. Great.
You met with the RAIQ tenants?
Today, yep, just finished.